The woman sitting in the front row couldn't stop smiling. To everyone else in the courtroom, it looked like justice was finally being served. The wife had lost. The husband had moved on. The mistress had won. At least, that's what everyone believed. But then something happened that nobody expected. A recording. A hidden recording. A recording so devastating that within minutes, a courtroom full of strangers would be left speechless. A judge would stop the proceedings. A wealthy businessman would turn pale. A mistress would suddenly lose her smile. And a woman named Scarlet would collapse onto the courtroom floor. Because after 3 years of lies, the truth was finally about to speak. And it had been recording everything. There are moments in life when a single sound can change everything. A ringing phone. A knock on a door. A voice on a recording. Moments that divide a person's life into 2 parts, before and after. On a cold Tuesday morning, inside a crowded courthouse, Scarlet Morgan experienced one of those moments. What happened that day would expose a secret that had remained hidden for years. It would reveal conversations nobody was supposed to hear. It would force powerful people to answer questions they thought would never be asked. And it would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a lie. It is the evidence that survives long enough to expose it. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Scarlet collapsed in that courtroom, we need to go back several years. Long before lawyers became involved. Long before court filings and sworn testimony. Back to a time when Scarlet believed she had everything she had ever wanted. She lived in a beautiful neighborhood outside Chicago. The streets were lined with large trees. Families gathered at local parks on weekends. Children rode bicycles through quiet streets. It was the kind of community people worked hard to reach. The kind of place where success appeared visible in every driveway and every carefully maintained lawn. Scarlet was 41 years old. She owned a successful interior design business. Friends described her as warm, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. She had spent years building her company from nothing. Her clients respected her. Her employees trusted her. She had earned every achievement through persistence and determination. But the accomplishment she valued most was her family. She had been married to Daniel Morgan for nearly 18 years. Together they had raised 2 children. Together they had purchased their first home. Together they had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and countless milestones. At least that was the version of the story Scarlet believed. Daniel was a respected businessman. He owned several construction companies and had built a reputation as someone who knew how to make money. He was confident, persuasive, and ambitious. People admired him. Many wanted to be him. He seemed to possess everything that defined success. Wealth. Influence. Connections. Confidence. To outsiders, the Morgans looked like the perfect American family. But appearances can be remarkably convincing. The first signs appeared quietly. So quietly that Scarlet almost ignored them. Daniel started working later than usual. Business trips became more frequent. Weekend meetings appeared on his schedule. Family dinners became rare. Vacations were postponed. Important conversations were delayed. At first Scarlet accepted every explanation. Marriage required trust, and trust meant believing your spouse when they told you they were busy. But eventually something changed. The explanations remained the same while the distance between them continued growing. Scarlet noticed Daniel protecting his phone more carefully. He took it everywhere. He never left it unattended. Messages were deleted quickly. Calls were taken in private. Sometimes she would wake up during the night and discover his side of the bed empty. When she found him downstairs, he always claimed he couldn't sleep. It sounded reasonable. Yet something about it never felt right. Months passed. The doubts grew stronger. Scarlet wanted to confront him. She wanted to ask direct questions. But fear stopped her. Because deep down she already suspected what the answers might be. There is a particular kind of fear that arrives when someone senses the truth before they can prove it. A fear that keeps people awake at night. A fear that forces them to question every memory and every promise. Scarlet carried that fear for nearly a year. Then came the charity gala. Hundreds of guests attended the event. Business leaders, community figures, investors, and local politicians filled the ballroom. Scarlet spent much of the evening speaking with clients and friends. Everything seemed ordinary until Daniel introduced her to a young woman named Vanessa Carter. Vanessa worked as a marketing consultant for one of Daniel's companies. She was attractive, confident, and remarkably comfortable around him. Scarlet immediately noticed how familiar they seemed with each other. Their conversations flowed effortlessly. Their smiles appeared natural. Their eye contact lingered longer than expected. Nothing was obvious enough to raise accusations. Yet something about the interaction stayed with Scarlet throughout the evening. When they returned home, she tried to dismiss the feeling. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself she was being unfair. But the image of Daniel and Vanessa continued replaying in her mind. Days later, it still bothered her. The truth finally arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. Scarlet had no intention of looking at it. For years she had respected his privacy. But then the screen lit up. One message. Only 6 words. I can't stop thinking about last night. The sender was Vanessa. Scarlet stared at the screen. Everything around her seemed to stop. The kitchen became silent. The rain outside faded into the background. For several seconds she simply stood there, unable to move. Because in that moment every suspicion she had carried for months became reality. The affair was real. And her life was about to change forever. What Scarlet didn't know was that discovering the affair was only the beginning. The betrayal she had uncovered was far smaller than the truth waiting beneath it. Because while Daniel and Vanessa were building a secret relationship, they were also creating a plan. A plan involving money, property, reputation, and a future they intended to build together. A future they believed Scarlet would never be able to stop. But somewhere, hidden from everyone involved, a recording device had already captured conversations that would eventually destroy everything they had worked to protect. And when those recordings finally reached a courtroom 3 years later, the people smiling the most would become the people with the most to lose. The message remained on the screen for only a few seconds, but for Scarlet, it felt as though time had stopped completely. She read the words again and again, hoping she had misunderstood them. Hoping there was another explanation. Hoping the woman she had met at the charity gala was simply a colleague who had chosen unfortunate wording. But deep inside, she already knew the truth. People often recognize the truth long before they are willing to accept it. Scarlet had spent months trying to convince herself that her marriage was simply going through a difficult season. Now the illusion had shattered. The evidence was staring directly at her. When Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later, he immediately noticed the expression on her face. He saw the phone resting on the counter. He saw the message still visible on the screen. And for the first time since their marriage began, he looked genuinely afraid. The confrontation that followed was nothing like the dramatic arguments often shown in movies. There were no shattered plates. No screaming matches. No neighbors gathering outside to listen. Instead, there was silence. Painful silence. Scarlet asked a simple question. She wanted only one thing. The truth. Daniel stood in the kitchen for nearly a minute before finally speaking. Then he admitted everything. The relationship with Vanessa had been going on for over a year. What began as business meetings had eventually become something more. Scarlet listened without interrupting. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before it. Every confession chipped away at nearly 2 decades of memories. She expected guilt. She expected regret. What she did not expect was Daniel's next statement. Looking directly into her eyes, he quietly said he had not been happy for a long time. The words struck harder than the affair itself. They transformed betrayal into something even more devastating. Over the following weeks, Daniel moved out of the family home. The children struggled to understand what was happening. Friends chose sides. Relatives offered advice. Some encouraged Scarlet to fight for the marriage. Others told her to move on. Scarlet did neither. She focused on surviving one day at a time. She continued running her business. She attended school events for her children. She paid bills. She smiled when necessary. But privately, she felt as though her entire world had collapsed. Every room in the house reminded her of a different memory. Every photograph seemed to belong to another life. The future she had imagined was gone. Yet despite everything, she believed the worst had already happened. She believed discovering the affair was the lowest point she would ever experience. She had no idea that much larger betrayals were still waiting to be uncovered. 6 months after leaving, Daniel officially filed for divorce. Scarlet expected the paperwork. What she did not expect were the demands inside it. Daniel was seeking a surprisingly large portion of the family's assets. He claimed ownership interests in accounts that Scarlet had personally built through her own business. He challenged property arrangements they had agreed upon years earlier. He questioned financial records that had never previously been disputed. Scarlet was shocked. The first major court hearing arrived nearly a year after Daniel moved out. The courtroom was crowded. Lawyers shuffled documents. Witnesses waited in hallways. Reporters occasionally covered the case because of Daniel's business reputation. Scarlet sat beside her attorney, trying to remain calm. Across the room sat Daniel. Beside him, in the gallery seating, was Vanessa. The moment Scarlet noticed her, she felt a wave of anger rise inside her. Vanessa looked completely relaxed. She smiled occasionally. She whispered to friends. She appeared remarkably confident. As though the outcome had already been decided. Scarlet tried to focus on the proceedings, but Vanessa's expression stayed in the back of her mind. Looking back, she would later realize that confidence had not come from optimism. It had come from information. The hearings continued for months. During that time, Daniel's legal team presented argument after argument portraying Scarlet in an unfavorable light. They questioned her financial decisions. They challenged her business records. They suggested she had mismanaged certain investments. Some claims contained fragments of truth. Others were greatly exaggerated. Yet repeated often enough, even weak allegations can begin influencing perception. Scarlet found herself constantly defending decisions she had made years earlier. Each hearing felt exhausting. Each ruling seemed to favor Daniel slightly more. Even her attorney became concerned. The evidence available to them was limited. Witnesses who might have helped were reluctant to get involved. Several important documents had mysteriously disappeared. It was as though every road leading to the truth had somehow been blocked. Then something happened that changed everything. Late one evening, Scarlet's attorney received a phone call from an unknown number. The caller refused to provide details over the phone. He insisted on a private meeting. He claimed to possess information relevant to the case. Information he believed a judge would want to hear. At first, the attorney assumed it was another rumor or disgruntled former employee seeking attention. But the caller sounded serious. More importantly, he sounded nervous. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Scarlet arrived expecting disappointment. Instead, she met a man named Robert Hayes. Robert had once worked closely with Daniel. For years, he had been one of the company's senior executives. He understood how the business operated. He understood Daniel's habits. And most importantly, he understood secrets few others knew existed. Robert looked exhausted. He spoke carefully. Several times he glanced toward the door as if worried someone might walk in unexpectedly. Then he placed a small flash drive on the table. Neither Scarlet nor her attorney spoke. Robert finally broke the silence. He explained that months earlier, he had discovered conversations that deeply troubled him. Conversations involving Daniel and Vanessa. At first he ignored them. Then he heard more. Eventually he realized something was happening that went far beyond an affair. What he had uncovered suggested manipulation, deception, and a coordinated effort to influence the outcome of the divorce. For nearly a year, he wrestled with whether to come forward. Fear kept him silent. But his conscience eventually became impossible to ignore. Then he looked directly at Scarlet and said something she would never forget. Everything they've told the court is built on a lie. Scarlet's heart began racing. Robert slowly pushed the flash drive across the table. Inside it was an audio file. A recording. A recording Daniel believed nobody would ever hear. A recording Vanessa believed no one had saved. A recording that would eventually bring an entire courtroom to a standstill. And when the judge finally listened to what was hidden inside that file, the smiles would disappear, the lies would unravel, and the truth that had been buried for 3 years would finally rise into the open. Scarlet stared at the flash drive resting on the table. It looked ordinary. Small. Forgettable. The kind of object people carried in their pockets every day without giving it a second thought. Yet Robert was looking at it as though it contained something dangerous. Something powerful enough to change lives. For several moments, nobody spoke. Scarlet's attorney finally inserted the drive into his laptop. A single audio file appeared on the screen. The recording was dated nearly 11 months earlier. Long before many of the court hearings had taken place. Long before several key financial disclosures had been submitted. Long before Daniel's attorneys had begun presenting their version of events. Robert took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. Then he quietly told them to listen carefully. What they were about to hear, he explained, would answer questions they didn't even know they should be asking. The recording began with the sound of glasses clinking together. There was faint music in the background. It sounded like a restaurant or private lounge. Several voices could be heard at first, but eventually most of the background conversation faded away. Then Scarlet heard a voice she immediately recognized. Daniel. Calm. Relaxed. Confident. The confidence in his tone surprised her. During the divorce proceedings, he had often portrayed himself as a victim of a difficult marriage. Yet the men speaking in the recording sounded nothing like the men who had appeared in court. He sounded pleased. Almost excited. A second voice entered the conversation moments later. Vanessa. The woman whose smile had haunted Scarlet for months. Scarlet felt her stomach tighten as she listened. Every instinct told her something important was coming. Something neither Daniel nor Vanessa ever expected another person to hear. At first, the conversation seemed harmless. They discussed travel plans. Business projects. Social events. Then the subject changed. Vanessa asked a question about the divorce. Daniel laughed softly before answering. What he said next caused Scarlet's attorney to pause the recording. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Daniel had openly admitted that several financial claims submitted during the divorce were intentionally misleading. He described certain asset transfers that had been arranged months before the separation. He spoke about moving money into accounts that would be difficult to trace. Most shocking of all, he discussed strategies for making Scarlet appear financially irresponsible. Not because it was true. Because it was useful. Scarlet felt her heart pounding in her chest. For over a year she had been defending herself against accusations she now knew were deliberately manufactured. The recording continued. With every passing minute, the situation became worse. Daniel and Vanessa discussed the divorce as if it were a business project. They spoke about deadlines, tactics, and outcomes. There was no sign of guilt. No indication that either of them felt remorse. Instead, they sounded focused on one goal, securing as much money and property as possible. Several times Vanessa suggested specific actions. Several times Daniel agreed. At one point, Vanessa laughed and said that once everything was finalized, Scarlet would never understand what had happened. The comment sent a chill through the room. Scarlet could barely believe what she was hearing. The woman who publicly presented herself as a supportive partner had been actively involved in discussions about dismantling her life. But the most devastating moment was still ahead. Nearly 40 minutes into the recording, the conversation shifted again. This time Daniel began discussing witnesses. Certain individuals, he explained, could create problems if they decided to speak honestly. He mentioned former employees, financial consultants, even mutual acquaintances. Then he described efforts to influence what some of those individuals might say if called into court. Scarlet's attorney immediately stopped the recording again. This wasn't merely unethical behavior. Depending on how the evidence was interpreted, it could suggest attempts to interfere with legal proceedings. The room became silent. Robert looked down at the floor. It was obvious he had struggled with the decision to come forward. Now Scarlet understood why. When the recording ended, nobody moved for nearly a minute. Scarlet felt overwhelmed. Angry. Relieved. Heartbroken. Vindicated. Emotions crashed into one another so quickly she could barely process them. For months she had questioned herself. Wondered whether she had somehow failed. Wondered whether the collapse of her marriage was entirely her fault. Now she was hearing evidence that painted a completely different picture. The affair had been real. But the affair was only part of the story. Behind it was something much larger. A deliberate effort to control the narrative, manipulate perceptions, and gain financial advantage through deception. Her attorney immediately recognized the significance of what they possessed. The recording alone would not automatically win the case. It would need to be authenticated. Investigated. Examined carefully. Over the following weeks, a team of specialists reviewed the recording. Audio experts examined the file. Investigators verified dates and locations. Additional documents were uncovered. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware. Court hearings continued as usual. He walked confidently into the courthouse. Vanessa continued appearing beside him. Observers noticed her familiar smile. Friends close to Scarlet later recalled how frustrating it was to watch. Every hearing seemed to reinforce Daniel's position. Every delay appeared to work in his favor. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa showed the slightest sign of concern. They behaved like people who believed the outcome was already secure. Then came the day everything changed. It was one of the most important hearings in the entire case. Lawyers, witnesses, financial experts, and reporters filled the courtroom. The atmosphere felt tense from the moment proceedings began. Scarlet arrived early. Her attorney carried several folders and a sealed evidence package. Daniel noticed it immediately. For the first time in months, uncertainty appeared on his face. Vanessa sat in her usual seat near the front. She looked confident. Comfortable. Completely unaware of what was about to happen. The hearing proceeded normally at first. Witnesses testified. Documents were reviewed. Arguments were presented. Then Scarlet's attorney stood and requested permission to introduce newly discovered evidence. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Daniel's legal team objected immediately. The judge listened carefully before asking a series of questions. Several minutes later, after reviewing preliminary information, the judge granted permission to proceed. No one in the room realized they were about to witness a moment that would be remembered long after the case ended. The recording was cued. The speakers were turned on. And as Daniel heard the first sound of his own voice echo through the courtroom, the confidence that had carried him through 3 years of deception began disappearing from his face. Across the room, Vanessa's smile faded for the very first time. And Scarlet, sitting silently beside her attorney, felt her hands begin to tremble as the truth finally prepared to speak in front of everyone. The moment the first words echoed through the courtroom, an almost unnatural silence settled over the room. It was the kind of silence that only appears when people suddenly realize they are witnessing something important. Every movement stopped. Every whispered conversation disappeared. Even the reporters sitting near the back lowered their pens and looked toward the speakers. Daniel's voice filled the room with a confidence nobody had heard from him during the trial. There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. No attempt to sound innocent. The men speaking on that recording sounded comfortable discussing matters he had spent months denying. For the first several minutes, nobody interrupted. The judge listened carefully. Scarlet's attorney remained seated. Daniel's legal team exchanged nervous glances. Across the courtroom, Vanessa's expression slowly began to change. The smile that had become so familiar throughout the proceedings started fading from her face. As the recording continued, the atmosphere grew heavier. Jurors were not present because this was a civil proceeding, but if they had been, many later believed the outcome would have become obvious within minutes. The conversation revealed details that directly contradicted multiple statements previously presented to the court. Daniel could be heard discussing financial arrangements he had denied existed. He spoke openly about moving assets before filing for divorce. He laughed about strategies designed to make certain records difficult to locate. The confidence in his voice made the content even more damaging. He wasn't speaking like a man worried about consequences. He was speaking like a man convinced he would never be caught. Several people in the gallery began looking toward Daniel instead of the speakers. They wanted to see his reaction. They wanted to know whether the man sitting before them was the same man whose voice was now filling the courtroom. The answer became clear quickly. Daniel's face had lost all color. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead. At one point, his attorney leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Daniel didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him. The confidence he had displayed for nearly 3 years seemed to be evaporating minute by minute. Vanessa appeared even more unsettled. Her hands were clasped tightly together. The woman who once looked relaxed and victorious now appeared deeply anxious. Several times she glanced toward the courtroom doors. Then came the portion of the recording that changed everything. Until that point, the evidence had been damaging. Embarrassing. Potentially devastating to Daniel's credibility. But what happened next elevated the situation to another level entirely. Vanessa's voice became clearer. The background noise faded. Then the courtroom heard a conversation neither Daniel nor Vanessa had ever expected anyone else to hear. They were discussing Scarlet directly. Not her finances. Not legal strategies. Scarlet herself. The tone of the conversation was cold. Detached. Daniel described her as an obstacle. A problem standing between them and the future they wanted. Vanessa laughed and suggested that once the divorce was finalized, Scarlet would have nothing left to fight with. Daniel responded by saying she wouldn't even understand how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. Several people in the gallery visibly reacted. The comments revealed something that had remained hidden throughout the trial. This was never simply about ending a marriage. It had become a campaign to defeat someone emotionally, financially, and publicly. Scarlet felt tears gathering in her eyes. For months she had questioned herself. She had replayed arguments in her mind. She had wondered whether she had somehow contributed to the collapse of her marriage. She had carried guilt that now seemed completely misplaced. Listening to the recording was painful because it confirmed something she never wanted to believe. The people she once trusted most had been discussing her suffering as though it were a strategy session. Every word felt like a fresh wound. Yet she forced herself to keep listening because she needed the truth. No matter how painful that truth might be. The judge remained remarkably composed throughout the recording. However, those closest to the bench later recalled subtle changes in his expression. He began taking more notes. He asked court staff to verify timestamps. Several times he requested clarification regarding evidence already submitted. It became increasingly clear that the recording was influencing how he viewed the entire case. Documents that once seemed persuasive suddenly required closer examination. Statements previously accepted as credible now appeared questionable. The foundation supporting Daniel's case was beginning to crack. Then came the final segment. Even Robert, the former executive who had delivered the recording, had warned Scarlet about this portion. He said it was the part that convinced him he could no longer remain silent. He said it was the reason he finally came forward despite the risks involved. The courtroom listened. Daniel's voice returned. Vanessa responded. Then Daniel made a statement that instantly changed the atmosphere. He admitted that if Scarlet ever discovered the full extent of what had happened, it would destroy her. Not financially. Not legally. Emotionally. Vanessa laughed. Then she asked a question. A simple question. What if she finds out? There was a brief pause. Then Daniel answered. She never will. The confidence in those 3 words echoed through the room. She never will. For years, he believed that. For years, he believed the truth would remain buried. For years, he believed the people he manipulated would never uncover what had really happened. Yet now his own voice was exposing everything. The recording ended. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that appears when an entire room is trying to process what it has just heard. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge looked down at the evidence before him. Daniel stared at the table. Vanessa looked completely shaken. And Scarlet? Scarlet suddenly felt the weight of 3 years crashing down on her all at once. The betrayal. The lies. The humiliation. The sleepless nights. The fear. The uncertainty. The endless court hearings. The attacks on her character. The photographs. The gossip. The loneliness. Every painful memory arrived at the same moment. Her breathing became shallow. Her vision blurred. She tried to steady herself. She tried to remain seated. But her body had reached its limit. As the judge began speaking, Scarlet's hands started trembling uncontrollably. Her attorney immediately noticed. He turned toward her and quietly asked if she was all right. Scarlet tried to answer. The words wouldn't come. The room began spinning. The sounds around her seemed distant. Someone called her name. Then another voice. Then another. And before anyone could react, Scarlet collapsed. Gasps filled the courtroom. Several people rushed toward her. Court officers moved quickly. Medical personnel stationed inside the building were called immediately. The judge halted the proceedings. Daniel instinctively stood from his chair. For a brief moment, the same men who had spent years fighting her appeared genuinely alarmed. Vanessa remained frozen in place. The woman who had entered the courtroom smiling now looked completely stunned. Because the victory she thought she had secured had vanished in less than an hour. The truth had finally spoken. And it had changed everything. As Scarlet lay unconscious on the courtroom floor, surrounded by concerned voices and rushing footsteps, nobody knew that the most shocking developments were still ahead. Because the recording was only the beginning. Investigators were already reviewing financial records. Additional witnesses were preparing to come forward. The courtroom drama that day made headlines. But what happened afterward would become the real story. And it would leave even the judge speechless. When Scarlet opened her eyes, she didn't immediately recognize where she was. The bright lights above her blurred together. Voices drifted in and out of focus. For several seconds, she simply stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. Then the memories came rushing back. The courtroom. The recording. Daniel's voice. Vanessa's laughter. The judge stopping the proceedings. The realization hit her like a wave. She was lying in a hospital room. A nurse standing nearby noticed she was awake and immediately called for the doctor. Fortunately, the collapse had not been caused by a serious medical condition. According to physicians, Scarlet's body had simply reached its breaking point after months of extreme emotional stress. Years of pressure, anxiety, heartbreak, and public humiliation had finally overwhelmed her system. Physically, she would recover. News of the courtroom incident spread quickly. Local media outlets reported on the dramatic hearing. Business publications picked up the story because of Daniel's reputation. Within days, articles began appearing across multiple platforms. Most focused on the recording. Others focused on Scarlet's collapse. Public opinion started shifting rapidly. For nearly 3 years, many people had accepted Daniel's version of events. Now they were hearing something very different. Friends who had distanced themselves from Scarlet began reaching out. Former colleagues offered support. Even individuals who barely knew her sent messages of encouragement. For the first time since the divorce began, Scarlet no longer felt completely alone. While Scarlet recovered, the legal consequences of the recording continued unfolding. The judge ordered an extensive review of financial records connected to the case. Independent forensic accountants were brought in. Their task seemed straightforward at first. Verify the claims discussed in the recording and compare them against official filings. What they discovered surprised even experienced investigators. Several transactions raised immediate concerns. Money had moved between accounts shortly before important court deadlines. Certain assets appeared to have been transferred through complex arrangements involving multiple entities. On paper, everything looked legal. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself facing a problem he could no longer control. Throughout the divorce proceedings, he had relied on confidence. Confidence in his lawyers. Confidence in his resources. Confidence in his ability to manage perceptions. Now that confidence was disappearing. Business associates started asking questions. Investors wanted explanations. Several partnerships suddenly became uncertain. Companies that once eagerly sought his involvement began creating distance. Reputation, which had taken decades to build, was beginning to crumble. Daniel spent years believing success protected him. He was learning that public trust can disappear much faster than it is earned. Vanessa faced her own challenges. For years, she had enjoyed the benefits of Daniel's wealth and influence. Luxury vacations. Exclusive events. Expensive gifts. The lifestyle many people only dream about. Yet as scrutiny intensified, that lifestyle became increasingly fragile. Friends who once admired her started avoiding her. Invitations stopped arriving. Social circles that had welcomed her began treating her differently. Then came another unexpected development. A second witness came forward. His name was Eric Lawson. Eric had previously worked as a financial consultant for one of Daniel's companies. During the early stages of the divorce, he remained silent. He feared professional consequences. He feared legal complications. Most of all, he feared becoming involved in a battle that seemed impossible to win. But after hearing the recording in court, he made a decision. He contacted investigators and requested a meeting. What he revealed added another layer to the growing case against Daniel. According to Eric, several financial transactions discussed in the recording had been intentionally structured to create misleading impressions regarding ownership and control of assets. Eric wasn't the last witness. Over the following months, others stepped forward as well. Former employees. Business associates. Administrative staff. Some shared documents. Others shared conversations they had previously dismissed as unimportant. Each new account strengthened the emerging narrative. People who once remained silent began realizing they were not alone. The recording had changed everything. It gave credibility to concerns that many had quietly carried for years. Suddenly, speaking up no longer felt impossible. The investigation expanded. Throughout all of this, Scarlet focused on healing. The process wasn't easy. There were days she felt hopeful. There were days she struggled. There were mornings when she woke up angry. There were nights when old memories returned unexpectedly. Yet something had changed. For years, she had been fighting to prove the truth. Now she no longer carried that burden alone. The evidence was speaking for itself. One afternoon, several months after the courtroom collapse, Scarlet returned to the courthouse. This time the atmosphere felt different. The fear that once accompanied every hearing was gone. The uncertainty that had haunted her for years had faded. As she entered the building, reporters gathered outside. Cameras followed her movement. Questions echoed through the hallway. Scarlet answered none of them. She wasn't there for publicity. She was there for closure. Inside the courtroom, Daniel looked dramatically different from the confident businessman who had once dominated proceedings. The stress showed clearly on his face. The endless investigations, legal challenges, and public scrutiny had taken their toll. Vanessa sat nearby, noticeably quieter than before. Gone was the woman who had smiled through previous hearings. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the appearance of victory. The judge reviewed months of findings. Evidence. Witness statements. Financial analyses. Recorded conversations. Expert reports. Page after page. Hour after hour. Then came the ruling. The courtroom listened carefully. The judge criticized numerous actions revealed during the proceedings. He questioned the credibility of key representations made throughout the case. He referenced evidence showing efforts to conceal information and distort financial realities. Several previous findings were reconsidered. For Scarlet, the legal details mattered. But they weren't the most important part. The most important moment came when the judge acknowledged the truth. Not every detail. Not every accusation. But the central truth. The truth Scarlet had been trying to tell for years. The truth many people doubted. The truth hidden beneath layers of manipulation and deception. She had not imagined it. She had not exaggerated it. And she had not deserved it. Those words brought tears to her eyes. Because sometimes validation arrives long after the damage is done. But when it finally arrives, it can still change everything. As people began leaving the courtroom, Scarlet remained seated for a few moments. She looked around the room where some of the most painful moments of her life had unfolded. The room felt different now. Smaller somehow. Less intimidating. The fear that once lived there no longer held power over her. Daniel left through a side exit surrounded by attorneys. Vanessa followed shortly afterward. Neither spoke to reporters. Neither looked toward Scarlet. Their chapter was ending. Not with the victory they imagined, but with consequences they never expected. Months later, Scarlet returned to her business full-time. Her children watched their mother slowly rebuild a life that had once seemed impossible to recover. New opportunities appeared. Old friendships returned. The scars remained, but they no longer controlled her future. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story was this. The recording that changed everything was never supposed to exist. A casual conversation. A forgotten device. A file nearly erased. A piece of evidence that survived by chance. Yet that single recording accomplished what years of arguments could not. It gave the truth a voice. And once that voice was finally heard, everything changed. Because lies can survive for a long time. They can influence people. They can shape reputations. They can even win battles. But eventually, the truth asks to be heard. And when it finally speaks, even the most carefully constructed stories can collapse in a single afternoon. That is exactly what happened to Daniel. That is exactly what happened to Vanessa. And that is why, years later, people still remember the day a woman named Scarlet collapsed in court, moments after the truth finally revealed itself. For more interesting story, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel.